Defining user permissions is a critical factor to ensure the security of our application and data within. So welcome to another Django Class-Based Views tutorial where we're having a look at permission checks. Permission checks are going to allow us to provide a method of limiting user access to model data and the actions the user can perform on models. In this tutorial, we'll specifically look at the PermissionRequiredMixin and take a look at how it works and how we can apply it within our application. In this tutorial, we will first of all review the permissions and authorization principles in Django, and then we'll start to actually apply some permission groups. So we'll develop and build a permission group, and then we'll see how the PermissionRequiredMixin works, apply permission checks to a model, and then go one step further because there are some different permutations utilizing the PermissionRequiredMixin. So we'll go ahead and build a custom mixin to overcome some of the issues that we might have with the PermissionRequiredMixin. So you might already be familiar with the fact that when we start a Django application, typically we have only one class of user in the Django Authentication framework. And here we can define two types of users, a super user and a staff user. If we take a look at the Django Authentication database or the Django database, you can see that we have an auth group permissions, and auth users. So these are typically the users that we create by default in Django. And you can see here some of the fields that are available. Two particular fields we have is staff and is super user. So here you can see that we define staff and super users based upon a Boolean that's defined in the auth users table. If we go into the Django administration, you can see that this admin user that I have here, the staff status and super user status is activated to true, therefore allocating those privileges to this particular user. So by default, Django has these two different user types. Super user has full access and control within the Django admin site, which I've just shown you. And the staff are able to log in, view the application models. They can view, update, and delete and edit the model data, and also change their password. And that's pretty much about it by default in Django, super user and staff. So as I've demonstrated in other tutorials, and as you probably already know, Django has built-in authentication, which allows us to add more users. And these are users that are not set to staff or super users. So therefore, any new users that we create, these new users have access to all of our models in our database, technically, and they can add, change, delete, and view any model. So just to further explain that point, if you remember I provided this example, I've been building this example in this series, whereby we've been creating some books, and then I gave you some examples of how to use different class-based views to, in this example, edit data. So we're not actually logged in here, but we still have the ability to actually update this data. And of course, this will change our database or our model data. So if I were to change this, remember I'm not logged in, and then just press submit, you can see that that actually makes a change in my database. So you can imagine how scary that would be, because you don't want users to be able to access data that's not intended or change data that's not intended to be changed by users. So this is why obviously we need permissions to grant different permissions based upon user access levels. So hopefully I've established the scary fact that when we create models by default in Django, anyone has access to add, change, and delete. So we need to find a way of adding permission checks. So in Django, when we create a new model, Django automatically creates some model permissions. These permissions include add, change, delete, and view. So these are individual permissions that we can add to users and groups. That's important to understand. So why would we not want to apply permissions per user? Imagine you've got a million users. Obviously, you don't want to add permissions potentially to individual users. It's much harder to manage and control. Therefore, generally, you would define or create users and groups. You would put users inside of groups. Those groups would then define the permissions that those users in the groups are allowed to perform. And that can be a much easier way to control and manage user permissions inside of your application. So that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to create a group, then we're going to create a new user, put the user in the group, and then add permissions to the group or assign permissions to that particular group. And then those permissions then will filter down to those users. So any users in that group will have the group permissions or have availability to the group permissions. And then we can go into the application and then actually apply permissions on a model. So as I stated in the first slide, we're going to be looking at the PermissionRequiredMixin. So this mixin is going to allow us to actually set user permissions or permission checks on models. So the PermissionRequiredMixin does have access to the access mixin, which just gives us a little bit more attributes or facilities or features that we can utilize. So if you want to follow along, the code is in the description. We're just going to log in first to the Django administration. It's admin and admin if you download the repository. And we're going to first of all set out by creating a new group. So you can see here in the authentication and authorization area, we have groups. And you can see that I've created a group here. So go ahead and add a new group. Let's do that. New group. And then here on the left-hand side, you can see some permissions. So notice that there is a permission for each and every model that we have. So in our application, we have the books model. And like I said before, every time we make a new model, Django creates an add, change, delete, and view permission. So that's exactly what you're seeing here. Now, of course, we can build our own permissions and so forth, but that's really out of the scope of this tutorial. And we will lead in towards that in further and later tutorials. So we're just looking at this here. So what we can do with this new group is that we can add the permissions that we want them to have. So we won't only want them to have access on this table or this model. So that's important to understand. You can start to see now how you may have different models within your application. And of course, you don't want users to be able to have access to it. So all that's needed is to create a group and ensure that that group doesn't have access to it. So we've done that now, so we can press save. So now we have our new group. So let's go back to the home and add a new user. So I've added a new user. Let's just add a new user. We'll add a new user. Okay, so I'll edit this out, maybe. Okay, so we add a new user. And you can see now at the bottom here, it's active. They're not staff status. I'm going to give them staff status in this case, simply because we can then log into the system. So you can see here, we now have two groups available. If I look down here, you can still add permissions. Add permissions to individual users if I wanted to, but of course I've got a group. So let's add the new group across. And then all that's needed then is just to press save. So I now have a new group and user, and the user is assigned to that particular group. So this is just a simple demonstration application. You can see it's all about books. We can click on the book and we can go into the individual book. And if I just add the word edit here, that takes me into an editing page. As I've already shown you, anyone can access this and add some new items here and edit the information. So that's all in place. So what we're going to do is we're going to utilize or edit the view to change the permissions to only allow certain users to access, or only allow certain users to access and actually perform those operations. So if you go into the code, you're going to see the books application right here. If you go into the views, you can see that so far in this series, we've added some different types of class-based views, and that's what you're looking at right here with some examples. So if you've looked at the other tutorials in this series, you probably are familiar with this. But what we're going to do here is we're going to take our book view or the book edit view. That's the view that you're seeing here when we edit the book. So when we go to edit here, this is what's being controlled by that glass view for us to be able to see this view. So what we're going to do is we're going to edit this and add in some items to add some permissions. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do is import the Mixin that I mentioned earlier, the PermissionRequiredMixin. So once that's been imported, I'll just remove this. We can now utilize this within our class-based views. So this is going to be slightly different if you're not using class-based views. So this tutorial is very specific to class-based views in case you're wondering if you can utilize this Mixin within a normal function view. So let's have a look at how to actually apply a permission. It's really simple. We'll put it up the top here. So we'll just add the permission required and define the permission that we want to define. So here we've got the books, change books. So if you remember, by default, Django provides us edit, view, change, and delete. So here we're defining change. So we're saying that the permission that you need to have on the books model is change. If you don't have this permission assigned to you, the user, then you won't be able to do it. That's what's going on here. So obviously what we're going to need to do is import this Mixin in, or add the Mixin into our class here. So now we have that available. So just to reiterate, what we're doing here is we're saying that the user must have this permission, the change permission, in order to actually perform the change. So now if I go back to the page and just refresh, you can see that it's okay because this particular user has permission. Now you're probably wondering, what particular user am I talking about? So obviously I'm logged in as the admin. So by default, the admin is going to have permission to everything. So this is why I can access the page. So let's just log out and we'll refresh the page. And now you can see we've been forwarded to the accounts login page. So if you're wondering why that is, if you remember the default authentication package within Django, this is the default login page URL. So you can see that's why we've been forwarded there. So by default, then we now realize that if we don't actually specify what to do, if a user is denied access to that page, then it's going to take you to the login page. Because here it's just assuming the fact that, okay, you want to access that, therefore you need to log in. That's essentially what it's saying. So if you're wondering what this next is, so this is something else that we can configure. Once we've logged in, that's where you're going to go next. So this is obviously a handy tool to ensure that when you are logged in, it just takes you back to where you are. So in terms of the user experience, that's probably a nice thing to have, or a nice feature to have, to ensure that the user just goes back to where they are. There's nothing more frustrating than you find a page you want to have a look at, you then log in, you have to log in, and then you have to go back and try and find the page. So this is just a helpful feature. Okay, so let's log in again as the user that we made. So this user, remember, has permissions that we define permissions for this user to be able to edit this page. So we need to go back and edit. So you can see that this user has edit permissions, therefore is allowed in. So let's just change this, new, and submit. And you can see that that has now worked. So let's just focus on that again. Let's just change this permission and ruin the permission. So we should provide an error now. So what happens is that when a user who is logged in but doesn't have permissions tries to access, we get the 403. So there's no easy way to deal with this by default. So we have to utilize or build a Mixin or define the parameters of what to happen if a user does that. So typically in our system, we wouldn't provide links for a user to access facilities within our application that they don't have access to. So this shouldn't really occur very often. So you just need to define in your application what to do, what actions to perform if this happens. So I'm going to decide in my application that if a user tries to access a resource and they don't have permission to access it, then I'll probably just take them back to either the previous page or take them back to the dashboard, the user dashboard. So we'll have a look at building that shortly, but let's just go back to defining some of the other parameters for users that aren't logged in and try to access this facility. So I'm just going to log out the user and then go back, and if I try and refresh, that's going to take us back to the login page. So let's try and overwrite some of these default behaviors. So as I previously shown you, the PermissionRequiredMixin inherits all the attributes from access Mixin. So if we were to have a look at the access Mixin, I think it's just here. If we were to have a look at the access Mixin, see if we can grab that. So you can see here we've got a number of different parameters or attributes that we can define. So let's go ahead and try some of these out. So first of all, we have the raise exception. So if we go ahead and add that in to false, go back into our application. Let's try to go back to our page. So we get the default behavior. So let's now try adding this to true. So what's going to perform now is that we should receive the error page. So if we go to edit, and then we get the 403. So why is that important? Well, maybe you want to manage your 403s a little bit differently in your application. So simply it just provides you a choice to either utilize the 403s and deal with it separately, or just to send the user to the login page. Now, from the top of my head, I think you can change this to a 404. Now, if you think about security-wise, if you were to provide a 403, that's suggesting that you need access to the system to access that resource, which kind of changes or identifies to the user trying to access something that there is something there to access. So for security reasons, to provide a 404 instead suggests that that link doesn't exist at all. Therefore, that resource doesn't exist. Therefore, there'd be no need for that person to try and or think about trying to access that resource anymore. Again, similar, if you link them back to a login page, then again, it's suggesting that there is something there to access. And that then potentially prompts the user to try and then access that in any way that they can. Apologies, I'm just generalizing, but hopefully you can kind of get the idea. If you provide someone a 404, that suggests that page doesn't exist, and that's the end of that. Whereas if you are providing a forbidden or sending someone back to a login page, suggests that there is a resource there to access. Okay, so we can extend this further and include the permission denied message, which is fairly self-explanatory, I think, at this point. So that is available. And then we also have the ability to change the login URL. So if you have defined a custom login facility within your application, you also have control of where you want to send the user. So finally, we have the redirect field name. So if I just set this back to false, we redirect the user. Notice the field name is next to begin with. So this is the default behavior in actual fact. So let's go ahead and just edit. It takes them back to, say, the login page. And here we have the next equals so on. So basically, we can just control this next item if we wanted to. So let's now create our own Mixin and deal with the issue that we saw previously, whereby when we are logged in and we try and access a resource, it takes us to the 403 because there's no other way by default to actually change that behavior. We're always going to receive the 403. So we need to override that and provide a different method or provide a different function to be performed so that we can send the user to something a little bit more useful. So I log in as the user B again, who does have permission to access. And I'm just going to change the item here, or it already is. So this is broken, don't forget, because I've added the S here, just to simulate that. So if I go back into the page and I just try and edit a page, I should be taken to the 403. So let's just now build a custom Mixin to actually perform that action. Now, if we perform or create our own custom Mixin, what that provides us is the ability to actually include it into other classes or other views, sorry. So we only have to write it once. Okay, so let's start off by creating a new class. I'm just going to call this user access Mixin. And you can see here that I take in the permission required Mixin. So I'm just going to extend from there. And then next up, first of all, I'm going to define what happens when someone who isn't logged in tries to access a resource. Okay, so let's start off by creating a new function here. So you can see that what we're going to do is overwrite the dispatch. So this is where we need to know a little bit about the update view and have a look at the MRO here and view the inherit methods and attributes. So this is what's currently being inherited by the update view here. Now, if you've seen the other tutorials in this series, you'll know that each and every class-based view takes in the view or inherits the view. And this is a particular class which is going to do all the kind of heavy lifting or the basic setup of your view. So you can see here the method flowchart. We have setup and dispatch. So essentially what we're doing here is we're overriding dispatch, or we're adding items to the dispatch to be performed by the view. So here you can read a little bit about what dispatch does and the reason potentially then why we're utilizing dispatch and we're not placing this anywhere else. So I apologize if that's not crystal clear. I haven't really explained what dispatch is for. So to try and summarize, the dispatch method basically takes in the request from the user and ultimately then returns a response. So that's essentially what this is going to perform, or what it's going to perform. So the idea here is that we're going to override or add new items here to ultimately capture some of the permissions that we want to apply before then it's passed over to the view. So we're going to add this Mixin into this view here shortly. This is going to be performed first, and then obviously the permissions are going to be checked before we then go through the view. So that's why we're going to add it into the dispatch. So let's go ahead first and organize the users if they're not logged in. So if not, and then request user is authenticated. So if the user is not authenticated, this is what we're trying to assess. Then what we're going to do is we're going to return the redirect to login. And we're going to create that with 3 items here. So we're going to use the request get full path. So that's the full path of our URL. And then we're going to set the get login URL. So essentially this is going to be here, the 127.001/8000. And then we're going to add the login URL. And then if we want to or need to, we're then going to utilize, if you remember, the redirect field name, the next, so that when someone does log in, it takes them to that page that they just came from. So that's what we're building there. Notice that it's in yellow. We're just going to add that. So Django views import redirect to login. So we'll add that in, so to utilize that. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and if not self has permission. So if you don't have permission, regardless whether you're logged in or not, this is going to happen. Now, obviously, we've already captured those who aren't logged in. So this is going to be applied to anyone who is logged in and doesn't have permission to access the resource. So here we're just going to return the redirect to books. So we're just going to redirect them to a page. Obviously, you can add your own line here, add your own code here and define what you want to be done with the user if they have not got access to the resource. So we just finish off by returning the super. And now what we can do is remove the permission required Mixin from our initial update view, add in our new Mixin right here. And this is obviously now going to utilize all of this that we've just written. So obviously now what we can do is we can go ahead if we wanted to and add this into our other classes, because all the other classes are inheriting the view, remember, and in the view we have the dispatch. So this is a generic Mixin that now we've created, and we can utilize in all of our views if we want to. So let's just do all the imports here. So we need to just import that from the views, and then the redirect also needs to be incorporated in. So just add that in from the shortcuts. And then let's just try this out. So we still messed up our permission required element here, and I'll explain this further shortly. So now we should be redirected to books. So previously we received this as we were logged in. So let's now refresh, and that takes us to /books. So you can see that our Mixin is working. Let's just change our permission back and just check to see if it's working. So this is what it should look like. Let's go back to our page and select a book. We type in edit, and it seems to be working because we're logged in as the user that has permissions. So let's just finish off by just re-establishing the fact that we have add, change, delete, and view. So we can utilize any of those in here. So we can use add if we want to, or view, and so on. So this is how we're going to define the permissions. So you can see we can also add multiple permissions. So if we wanted to, we just need to add the parentheses and add a comma, and then add another permission right there. So we can add multiple permissions if we want to. Well, I do hope that was valuable to you or for you, and you can now start applying that within your application. Of course, there's other checks and other methods that can be utilized. Like I mentioned, this is very much a class-based view permission check. So you would want to utilize a different methodology for, a different method for function-based views. But you can have a look at the documentation in Django, and the principles of this, defining permissions to groups, etc., is all very similar. So I thank you again for listening, and hopefully I'll see you in the next tutorial. Thank you very much.